So this stuff is extremely difficult, and it's kind of meant to be difficult. I'm not going to ask anyone to come up here and describe what they've done because it's not necessary. I wanted you to just start to think in these terms. Now, the biggest reason that all of this is difficult is I asked you to look at your games in their entirety, your projects, like all of them, and try to break it down in aesthetics and dynamics and mechanics. So here's a secret. Usually you don't do this because it's really, really difficult. Depending on how you want to describe stuff, setting up your aesthetic, your intended aesthetic, is relatively easy, right? Setting up your mechanics takes a lot longer because if you want to set up your list of mechanics, you're making a list of all the different gameplay that's in there. So here's the criteria for winning, here's the criteria for losing, here are the actions that the player can engage in, here are the actions that the AI can engage in. A longer list, more difficult to write, but it's still manageable. Writing dynamics, that's the hard one. Writing dynamics is almost impossible. Why? Because if you want to reduce your game down to the dynamics of it, what exactly are you looking at? Two players will not necessarily play the game in the exact same way. So how can you look at something and say, well, this is, you can only speak in terms of what is a typical play session going to look like? What does the average play session look like? And even then, it's not perfect. So usually what people do is they look at things in terms of one component at a time. And oftentimes people will actually start by looking at a dynamic and analyzing that. For example, one of the ways this method is sometimes taught is by making a very simple board game and pen and paper game. That's how I learned it almost 10 years ago. And what we did then is we were given a game that was kind of broken, but very simple. And what we were asked to do was play this game, play a few rounds of this game, and then observe what happens. And what happened was every time, regardless of which group you were looking at, certain behaviors were constant and consistent with, with every group. So what happened was everyone kind of sort of started playing certain aspects of the game in the same way because that's what the game suggested that they would do, right? So the exercise was focus in on that thing, try to identify why it happens, ask yourself, is it a problem? And if it is a problem, figure out how to change it. But that's just focusing on one thing. If we were to go back through those games that I showed you before, Zelda and Resident Evil and all these other ones, if I were to ask you, can you describe to me the dynamics of that game? That can be really difficult. Imagine describing Zelda at that level. Yeah, so the player jumps in and then he runs around a little bit and then he forgets where he's supposed to go, so he just runs around and he destroys some bushes and then some enemies show up. That's not useful in any way. But maybe you'll be able to identify a dynamic in the game rules. For instance, the player never uses the slingshot, or the player never uses the bow, or the player only plays in such a way where they fight a dungeon, they play until they get a new item, and then they leave the dungeon before they've actually finished it. That is a behavior that we might not actually like. And this is extremely important when we start using stuff like metrics, right? You guys had a session just before this, I think, with some talk about metrics and stuff. When you're using metrics, the simplest thing to learn from metrics is player behavior. That is the most, you can't know what they're thinking, but you know what they're doing. So looking at a certain type of player behavior is very useful if you have the MDA method as a tool. When you see that people are playing the game in a certain way statistically, then you'll be able to observe your mechanics and ask yourselves, what is it in our mechanics that is actually suggesting to players that they play in this way? And if they are playing the game in this way, they're not really being consistent with the fiction that we're trying to sell them. They're not playing like a ruler of a medieval kingdom or something like that. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about this exercise. If you guys have written anything down, if you guys have made any notes or anything whatsoever, keep those because we will come back to them later on today.